The morning sun filtered through the blinds of Justice Elena Martinez's Georgetown apartment. She sat at her kitchen table, a steaming cup of coffee warming her hands as she looked through the window at the quiet street below. Today was not a day for legal briefs or constitutional debates. Today was for remembering where she came from. Elena ran her fingers through her salt and pepper hair, examining her reflection in the small mirror hanging in her entryway. At 62, the lines on her face told stories of countless late nights poring over legal documents and the weight of decisions that affected millions of Americans. But today, those responsibilities would wait. She chose her outfit carefully, worn blue jeans that had seen better days, comfortable walking shoes, and her favorite navy sweater with small holes near the cuffs. Nothing about her appearance suggested she was one of the 9 most powerful judges in the United States. The diamond studs she usually wore, a gift from her late mother when Elena graduated from law school, were replaced with simple wooden earrings bought at a street fair. "Perfect," she whispered to herself. The woman staring back from the mirror looked like any other grandmother getting ready for a casual Saturday outing. Elena had made this journey many times before, especially when the burden of her position felt heaviest. The Bronx neighborhood where she grew up centered her in a way nothing else could. It reminded her why the work mattered, not for the history books or legal scholars, but for real people living real lives. The subway car rocked gently as it carried her from the polished streets of Washington, D.C., to the familiar rhythm of her childhood home. Elena watched the landscape change through the windows, from monuments and government buildings to the honest grit of city neighborhoods that raised her. A young woman with a sleeping baby noticed Elena, smiling at the child, and offered a tired smile in return. "How old?" Elena asked softly. "Just turned 4 months yesterday," the woman replied, gently stroking the baby's cheek. "Treasure these moments," Elena said. "My grandson is 12 now and thinks he's too cool for grandma hugs." They chatted easily about sleepless nights and first smiles, 2 women connecting over shared human experiences. The young mother had no idea she was talking to the author of a landmark decision that had protected her maternity leave rights just last year. When the train pulled into her stop, Elena wished the woman well and stepped onto the platform. The station hadn't changed much in 50 years, still the same cracked tiles and echoing announcements. She took a deep breath, letting the familiar sounds and smells wash over her. Walking up the stairs and emerging onto the street felt like stepping back in time. Some storefronts had changed, but the spirit remained. Children kicked soccer balls against brick walls while older folks watched from folding chairs, just as they had when she was a girl running these same streets. Elena passed the public library where she'd spent countless hours as a child, devouring books about far-off places and historical figures who changed the world. The building had been renovated, but the lion statues guarding the entrance remained the same. She patted one on the head as she walked by, a private tradition from her childhood. Her stomach growled, reminding her of the real purpose of today's journey. 3 blocks down and 1 avenue over stood Rosa's Diner, a neighborhood institution for over 40 years. The food was nothing fancy, just honest, hearty meals that satisfied both hunger and nostalgia. The bell above the door jingled as Elena pushed it open. The familiar scent of coffee and fresh-baked bread enveloped her. Saturday mornings meant Rosa's was packed, with a line of customers waiting for tables. Elena joined the queue, perfectly content to wait her turn like everyone else. The diner buzzed with weekend energy, families catching up over pancakes, couples sharing sections of the newspaper, solo diners reading books while nursing cups of coffee. No one gave Elena a second glance. Here, she wasn't Justice Martinez of the Supreme Court. She was just another customer waiting for breakfast. Rosa herself still worked the counter at 75 years old. Her hair was fully white now, tied back in the same practical bun she'd worn since Elena was a teenager coming in for after-school milkshakes. When Rosa spotted Elena in line, her face broke into a wide smile, but she didn't make a fuss. She understood Elena's need for normalcy during these visits. "The usual table will be ready in about 15 minutes, honey," Rosa called over with a wink. Elena nodded gratefully. The usual table was tucked in the back corner, partially hidden by a large plant, offering some privacy while still allowing her to observe the heart of the diner. While waiting, Elena scanned the framed photographs covering the walls. Most showed neighborhood scenes through the decades: block parties, snowstorms, graduation celebrations. In one small frame near the register hung a photo from Elena's swearing-in ceremony. Rosa had placed it there quietly, never mentioning it to Elena, but keeping this small tribute to the neighborhood girl who rose to such heights. The couple ahead of Elena received their buzzer, and she stepped forward to the hostess stand. The young hostess, probably a college student working weekend shifts, handed Elena her own buzzer with a distracted smile. "Shouldn't be too long," she said, already looking past Elena to the next customer. Elena found a spot near the door to wait, leaning against the wall and watching the sidewalk through the large front windows. A group of teenage boys passed by, laughing and pushing each other good-naturedly. They reminded her of her grandson, in that awkward stage between childhood and adulthood. Her buzzer vibrated, and Elena returned to the hostess stand. The young woman led her through the packed diner to her corner table. It wasn't the most desirable spot, being far from the windows, but for Elena, it was perfect. "Your server will be right with you," the hostess said, placing a menu on the table before hurrying away. Elena didn't need to look at the menu. She ordered the same meal every visit: 2 eggs over easy, whole wheat toast, crispy hash browns, and endless refills of Rosa's strong coffee. But she opened it anyway, enjoying the simple routine of a Saturday morning breakfast. A waitress Elena didn't recognize approached with a coffee pot. "Coffee to start?" she asked, already pouring into the mug. "Yes, thank you," Elena replied, wrapping her hands around the warm ceramic. "Ready to order or need a minute?" The waitress balanced her coffee pot in one hand and pulled out her notepad with the other. Elena placed her usual order, and the waitress jotted it down before disappearing into the kitchen chaos. Left alone with her thoughts, Elena took a small notebook from her purse. Another tradition of these visits was writing letters, real handwritten notes to people who'd touched her life. Today's letter was for her law clerk who was finishing his term with her next month. She had just started writing when the bell above the door chimed again. 4 young people entered, talking animatedly amongst themselves. From their conversation, Elena could tell they were law students, probably from Columbia or NYU based on the books they carried. They were seated at a table not far from Elena's corner, still deep in discussion about what sounded like constitutional law. Elena couldn't help but smile, remembering her own days as a passionate law student, convinced she understood everything about justice and the law. "Professor Chen's take on the Martinez opinion is too conservative," said one young woman, dropping her heavy bag beside her chair. "The reasoning was actually quite progressive if you consider the historical context." Elena's ears perked up at the mention of her name. They were discussing one of her recent opinions, a complex ruling on privacy rights in the digital age. She continued writing her letter but listened with interest to their debate. "Progressive? Are you kidding?" countered a young man with glasses. Martinez completely sidestepped the real issue. "I bet she's never even used social media. These judges are so disconnected from regular people's lives." Elena bit back a smile. If only he knew she had both Twitter and Instagram accounts that her teenage granddaughter had set up for her. She didn't post much, but she liked staying connected to how people communicated in today's world. Another student joined in. "The problem with Martinez is she tries to please everyone. That privacy opinion started strong but ended with so many exceptions that it basically undermined itself." The criticism didn't bother Elena. In fact, she welcomed it. This was why she came back to the neighborhood, to hear real thoughts from real people, unfiltered by the deference that surrounded her in court. These students had no idea they were critiquing her work right in front of her, and that made their comments all the more valuable. Her breakfast arrived, steam rising from the perfectly cooked eggs and crispy hash browns. Elena thanked the waitress and tucked into her meal, still listening to the students' increasingly heated debate. A 4th student, quieter than the others, finally spoke up. "I actually think the Martinez framework makes sense for where we are right now. The law can't move too far ahead of society or it loses legitimacy." "That's such a cop-out," the young man with glasses replied. "The Supreme Court should lead, not follow. If Martinez was sitting here right now, I'd tell her exactly that." Elena nearly choked on her coffee, amused by the irony. She dabbed her mouth with a napkin and continued eating, wondering what these bright young minds would think if they knew Justice Elena Martinez was the unassuming older woman enjoying her eggs just a few tables away. The diner grew busier as the morning progressed. Families with children filled the larger tables, the sounds of clinking silverware and conversation creating a comforting backdrop. Elena finished her meal slowly, savoring both the food and the anonymity. When the waitress brought her check, Elena left a generous tip, another tradition from these visits. Her parents had taught her that success meant lifting others up, not setting yourself apart. A good tip for a hard-working server was a small way to honor that teaching. As she gathered her things to leave, Elena glanced once more at the law students, still deep in their constitutional debate. She smiled to herself, thinking how much their passion reminded her of her own journey. Perhaps one of them would sit on the bench someday, facing their own critics and supporters. For now, though, she was content to be just another customer at Rosa's, a woman connected to her roots, carrying the responsibility of her position while never forgetting where she came from. Elena had just finished her breakfast and was enjoying the last sips of her coffee when the group of law students grew even louder. Their debate about her recent privacy ruling had attracted attention from nearby tables, with several diners glancing over with mild annoyance. The young man with glasses seemed particularly fired up, his voice rising with each point he made. "Look, all I'm saying is that these judges live in a bubble," he insisted, gesturing with his fork. "They go from elite law schools to fancy firms to the bench without ever experiencing how their decisions affect ordinary people." His friend, a young woman with curly hair pulled into a messy bun, nodded in agreement, especially Martinez. "Did you read that profile in the law review? Lives in Georgetown, drives a luxury car, probably has never taken public transportation in decades." Elena smiled into her coffee cup. She'd sold her car 3 years ago, preferring to walk or take the metro. The luxury car mentioned in that profile had been a 12-year-old sedan she'd finally donated to a community college's automotive program. The quieter student who had defended her earlier spoke up again. "I don't think that's fair. Her background is actually pretty humble. First-generation college student, public defender for years before becoming a judge." "Yeah, like 50 years ago." The young man with glasses scoffed. "People change. Power changes them." Elena considered slipping out quietly as she usually did during these visits. She'd gotten what she came for: good food, familiar surroundings, and a reminder of the real-world impact of her work. But something about this particular group of students intrigued her. Their passion was genuine, even if their assumptions about her were wildly inaccurate. Rosa appeared at Elena's table, refilling her coffee without asking. "These kids," she whispered with a knowing smile. "They think they know everything." "We were the same at their age," Elena replied softly. "You gonna say something?" Rosa asked, nodding toward the students. Elena shrugged. "I haven't decided." Rosa squeezed her shoulder gently before moving on to other tables. Elena had just about made up her mind to leave when she overheard the students discussing a new topic, an upcoming case on the Supreme Court docket involving public housing and eminent domain. "This case is going to be the real test for Martinez," said the young woman with the messy bun. "She claims to care about working-class communities, but I bet she sides with the developers." The young man nodded emphatically. "Of course she will. That whole grew up in the Bronx story makes for good press, but people forget where their bread is buttered." That stopped Elena in her tracks. The Bronx housing case was one she'd been researching extensively, staying up late reading the amicus briefs and historical precedents. The case touched on issues very personal to her. Her own grandmother had lost her apartment to a similar development project in the 1970s. Before Elena could think better of it, she stood up and approached their table. The 4 students looked up in surprise as she stopped beside them. "Excuse me," she said with a gentle smile. "I couldn't help overhearing your conversation about the Martinez opinion in the upcoming housing case. I find it all quite fascinating." The students exchanged glances, clearly trying to figure out why this older woman in casual clothes was interrupting their discussion. The young man with glasses seemed annoyed, while the quieter student who had defended her opinion looked embarrassed. "Are you a lawyer?" asked the young woman with the messy bun, her tone somewhere between curious and dismissive. "I've worked in the legal field, yes," Elena replied, purposely vague. "Do you mind if I join you for a moment?" I'd love to hear more about your perspectives on the housing case. There was an awkward pause before the fourth student, who had been mostly silent, slid over to make room. Sure, why not? We're just having a study group debate. Thank you, Elena said, sitting down. I'm Elena. She offered no last name, and thankfully none of them seemed to make the connection. I'm Trey, said the young man with glasses, still looking skeptical. That's Audrey, Pavel, and Jin. He pointed to each of his friends in turn. So you're interested in Supreme Court cases? Audrey asked, stirring her coffee absently. Very much so, Elena replied, especially cases like the Bronx housing situation. I actually grew up near that neighborhood. That caught their attention. Pavel leaned forward. Really? So what do you think about it? Should the residents be forced out for economic development? Elena considered how to respond without revealing too much. Well, I believe context matters enormously in these cases. There's a human element that can sometimes get lost in legal abstractions. Trey rolled his eyes slightly. With all due respect, that sounds exactly like the kind of non-answer Justice Martinez would give. The law is supposed to be clear, not contextual. Elena smiled, genuinely amused by the irony. The law exists to serve people, not the other way around. At least that's how I see it. And people's lives are inherently contextual and complex. But that's the problem with the current court, Audrey jumped in. They hide behind complexity when they're really just protecting powerful interests. The Martinez privacy opinion started strong but ended with so many loopholes you could drive a truck through them. Instead of feeling defensive, Elena felt curious. Which parts did you find problematic specifically? For the next several minutes, Audrey detailed her criticisms of the opinion, some of which Elena privately acknowledged were fair points. The young woman clearly had a sharp legal mind and had read the opinion carefully, not just the media summaries. Those are thoughtful critiques, Elena said when Audrey finished. Have you considered that some of those apparent loopholes might be intentional space, left for future cases to develop the doctrine further? Pavel nodded enthusiastically. That's what I've been saying. Martinez was playing the long game. Better to get a 7-2 opinion with some compromises than a 5-4 that could be easily overturned later. The conversation shifted to broader questions of judicial philosophy. Elena asked more than she answered, genuinely interested in how these young minds approached legal problems. Their perspectives were refreshing, unconstrained by the institutional caution that sometimes affected her colleagues on the bench. You know a lot about this stuff, Fur. Trey trailed off, clearly trying to find a polite way to reference her age and casual appearance. For someone who looks like me, Elena finished for him, her eyes twinkling. I've followed the court for many years. You could say it's a passion of mine. Jin, who had been quiet until now, studied Elena with curious eyes. You talk like a lawyer. The way you frame questions, how you listen before responding. Did you practice law? Elena nodded. For quite some time. What kind of law? Jin pressed. I started in public defense, then moved through various areas, she replied, again keeping it vague. But I'm more interested in hearing your thoughts on the Bronx case. Trey, you seemed certain Justice Martinez would side with the developers. What makes you so sure? Trey shifted uncomfortably, perhaps realizing how dismissive he'd sounded earlier. It's just the pattern with the court recently. They talk about individual rights but ultimately defer to economic interests. And you think Justice Martinez follows this pattern? Elena asked. I don't know, Trey admitted, more thoughtful now. Her voting record is actually more complicated than I initially thought. The privacy opinion frustrated me because it came so close to establishing a clear doctrine, then backed away at the crucial moment. Maybe she was building a foundation, Elena suggested. Sometimes you have to meet your colleagues where they are before you can bring them where you want to go. Pavel snapped his fingers. That's exactly what Professor Chen said. That Martinez is playing chess while everyone else is playing checkers. Elena laughed. I don't know about that. Judges are just people trying to interpret complex laws in changing times. They make mistakes. The slip didn't seem to register with the students. Their conversation continued, touching on other recent cases and the dynamics between different justices. Elena was impressed by their knowledge and passion, even when she disagreed with their conclusions. After about 20 minutes, Elena glanced at her watch. I should probably let you get back to your study session. Thank you for letting me join you. It's been truly enlightening. You should come to our mock court at Columbia next Friday, Jen suggested. We're arguing the Bronx housing case. It would be interesting to get your perspective. That's very kind, Elena replied. I might just do that. As she stood to leave, Audrey looked up at her. You never really told us what you think Justice Martinez will decide in the housing case. Elena considered the question carefully. I think she'll listen to all sides, research thoroughly, and make the decision she believes best serves both the law and the people affected by it. That's a non-answer, Trey said, but his tone was lighter now, almost teasing. It's the only honest answer anyone can give, Elena replied with a smile. Even Justice Martinez probably doesn't know her final decision yet. That's how the process works. She thanked them again and walked back to her table to gather her things. As she put on her jacket, she could hear them resuming their debate, but with a slightly different tone. The conversation had shifted from personal criticism to a more nuanced discussion of judicial reasoning. Rosa appeared at her side as she was leaving. Those kids had no idea who they were talking to, did they? No, Elena said with a smile. And that's exactly how I wanted it. Will you tell me how the Bronx case turns out? Rosa asked quietly. My sister's family lives in one of those buildings. Elena squeezed her old friend's hand. I'll make sure you know as soon as the decision is made. Outside, the spring air felt fresh after the warmth of the diner. Elena decided to walk a few blocks before catching the subway, back to D.C. The conversation with the students had energized her in a way that formal legal arguments rarely did, nowadays. Their passion reminded her why she had become a lawyer in the first place, not for the prestige or power, but because the law, at its best, was about protecting people's dignity and rights. Sometimes in the marble halls of the Supreme Court, surrounded by centuries of tradition and protocol, that fundamental purpose could become obscured. As she walked past the playground where she had spent countless hours as a child, Elena made a mental note to have her clerks dig deeper into the historical context of the Bronx housing development. The students had raised some points she hadn't considered fully. This was why she came back to her old neighborhood, why she sought out these anonymous encounters. Not just to remember where she came from, but to be challenged in ways that wouldn't happen when people knew who she was. A group of children raced past her, laughing as they chased a soccer ball. Elena watched them for a moment, thinking about how their lives would be shaped by the decisions she and her colleagues made. It was a heavy responsibility, but conversations like today's helped make that burden a little lighter, a little clearer. With renewed purpose, she headed toward the subway station. She had reading to do before Monday's conference. Elena had only gone half a block from Rosa's diner when she heard footsteps hurrying behind her. Excuse me. Elena, wait up. She turned to see Jin, the quietest of the 4 law students, jogging to catch up with her. His breath made small clouds in the cool spring air. I'm glad I caught you, he said, catching his breath. I wanted to apologize for my friends, especially Trey. He can be pretty harsh sometimes. Elena smiled warmly. No apology needed. Passionate debate is healthy, especially for law students. Jin shifted his weight from one foot to the other. The thing is, I recognize you. I wasn't sure at first, but now I am. Elena's heart skipped a beat. She'd been recognized occasionally during these neighborhood visits, but it was rare. When it happened, she usually acknowledged it with a polite request for discretion and moved on. But something told her this conversation might be different. You attended a guest lecture at Columbia last semester, Jin continued, on the evolution of privacy law. You weren't the main speaker. You were in the audience asking questions. But the way you challenged the presenter's arguments, I never forgot it. Relief washed over Elena. He didn't recognize her as Justice Martinez, just as someone he'd seen at a law school event. You have a good memory, she said. That was an interesting lecture, though I disagreed with several points. That's why I remembered you. The speaker was this famous judge from the Second Circuit, and everyone was treating him like his word was gospel. But you asked these incredibly insightful questions that kind of dismantled his whole framework. It was amazing. Elena remembered the event well. She'd gone incognito to hear a former colleague speak, sitting in the back row wearing casual clothes similar to today's outfit. When the judge had made some sweeping statements about technology and privacy that troubled her, she hadn't been able to resist raising her hand. Would you have time for coffee? Jin asked hesitantly. I'd love to get your perspective on something I'm working on. It's actually related to the Bronx housing case. Elena checked her watch. Her train back to D.C. wasn't for another few hours. I'd like that, she said. There's a coffee shop around the corner that used to be good. Let's see if it still is. As they walked, Jin explained that he was writing his law review note on the tension between economic development and community preservation, focusing on historically underserved neighborhoods. The professor supervising me thinks it's too ambitious, he admitted as they entered the small coffee shop. But this issue is personal for me. My grandparents lost their home to a similar project in Philadelphia. The personal connection will make your work stronger, Elena said as they found a quiet table by the window. Just make sure it informs your analysis rather than overwhelming. After ordering, a simple black coffee for Elena and a elaborate iced concoction for Jin, they settled into a surprisingly comfortable conversation. Elena was careful to speak as a knowledgeable lawyer, not as a Supreme Court justice, asking Jin thoughtful questions about his research. The problem with most legal analyses of these cases, Jin explained, growing animated, is that they treat housing purely as property rather than as home. There's this whole dimension of community and belonging that gets completely ignored. Elena nodded. The law often struggles with values that can't be easily quantified. Exactly. The economic benefits of development can be calculated in dollars. But how do you measure the value of Mrs. Lee knowing every child on the block for 3 generations? Or Mr. Diaz's corner store where he keeps a tab for families when they're short on cash? These were precisely the kinds of considerations Elena had been wrestling with as she prepared for the Bronx case. The legal precedents were clear enough, but they felt inadequate to the human dimensions of the situation. Have you considered interviewing residents? She suggested. First-hand accounts might strengthen your argument about the non-economic values at stake. Jin's face lit up. I hadn't thought of that. It would make the paper more compelling if I could include real stories. He hesitated. Would you? I mean, if you're not too busy, would you be willing to read a draft when I get further along? Your perspective would be really valuable. Elena considered carefully before answering. This was crossing a line she usually maintained during these anonymous excursions, but she was genuinely interested in Jin's approach, which might offer insights relevant to her own thinking on the case. I'd be happy to, she said finally. Though I should warn you, I'm a demanding reader, Jin grinned. That's exactly what I'm hoping for. They exchanged email addresses, Elena giving him the personal address she used for family and old friends, not her official court account. Their conversation shifted to Jin's background and aspirations. He was a first-generation college graduate whose parents had immigrated from Taiwan, with little money but enormous determination. His father still ran the dry cleaning business they had built from scratch. They wanted me to be a doctor, Jin confessed with a small smile. When I told them I was applying to law school, my father didn't speak to me for 2 weeks. But now he brags to all his customers about his son, the lawyer, or almost lawyer. Parents come around, Elena said, thinking of her own father who had initially been baffled by her legal ambitions. They just want security for their children. What about you? Jin asked. What drew you to law? Elena sipped her coffee, considering how to answer truthfully without revealing too much. I grew up not far from here, she said, in a neighborhood where people often felt powerless against forces controlling their lives, landlords, police, government agencies. I wanted to help balance those scales. And did you? Balance the scales, I mean. She thought about her decades-long career, the victories and defeats, compromises, and bold stands. Sometimes, she answered honestly, not as often as I'd hoped. The law is a blunt instrument for social change. Necessary but not sufficient, Jin nodded thoughtfully. That's why I'm considering policy work after clerking. Maybe the real changes happen before cases reach the courts. There's wisdom in that, Elena acknowledged, though we need good people in all parts of the system. Their conversation was interrupted by a text alert on Jin's phone. He checked it quickly, then looked up apologetically. It's Audrey. They're wondering where I disappeared to. We're supposed to finish preparing for a moot court competition this afternoon. You should get back, Elena said. Thank you for the coffee and conversation. Jin gathered his things but seemed reluctant to leave. Can I ask you something that might sound strange? Of course. Have we met somewhere besides that Columbia lecture? There's something familiar about you that I can't quite place. Elena kept her expression neutral. I don't think so. I have one of those faces people often find familiar. Jin didn't look entirely convinced but nodded anyway. I should go. I'll email you about that draft in a few weeks if that's okay. I'll look forward to it. After Jin left, Elena remained at the table, finishing her coffee and reflecting on their conversation. She had come to the Bronx seeking connection to her roots and had found something unexpected, a fresh perspective on a case that had been occupying her thoughts for months. Jin's emphasis on home versus property, on the intangible values of community, articulated something she had been feeling but hadn't fully formulated in her own analysis. It wasn't that she hadn't considered these factors, but hearing them expressed so directly by someone with personal stakes in the matter clarified their importance. This was why she valued these anonymous excursions, not just to remember where she came from, but to encounter viewpoints she might not hear within the formal structures of the court. As a justice, she was typically presented with carefully crafted arguments from experienced advocates. Valuable as those were, they sometimes lacked the raw authenticity of Jin's passion for justice. Elena paid for her coffee and headed back out into the spring day. She had planned to visit her old apartment building, and perhaps the high school she had attended, but now she felt drawn to the neighborhood at the center of the housing case. It was a 15-minute subway ride away. As the train rocked and swayed, Elena thought about Jin's suggestion to gather first-hand accounts from residents. While that was appropriate for a law review article, it would be highly unusual for a Supreme Court justice to conduct such informal research. Justices relied on the record established in lower courts and the briefs submitted by parties and amici. And yet, wasn't the purpose of her incognito visits precisely to step outside the formal constraints of her role? Not to bypass proper judicial procedure, but to maintain her connection to the human realities behind legal abstractions. When she emerged from the subway station, Elena found herself in a neighborhood similar to the one where she'd grown up, a mix of older apartment buildings, small businesses and community spaces showing signs of both neglect and resilient care. Children played in a small park while older residents sat on benches watching over them. The 6-block area targeted for redevelopment was marked by construction barriers and signs, announcing the future luxury condominiums and retail spaces that would replace the existing structures. Some buildings had already been vacated, their windows dark and empty, while others still showed signs of life. Curtains in windows, plants on fire escapes, laundry strung across balconies. Elena walked slowly through the area, observing without intruding. Outside one building, an elderly man sat on a folding chair, nodding to passers-by. When Elena approached, he looked up with curious eyes. "You looking for someone?" he asked. His voice was gruff but not unfriendly. "Just walking," Elena replied. "I grew up in a neighborhood like this. Not far from here?" The man studied her for a moment, then nodded as if that explanation satisfied him. "Won't be like this much longer. They're pushing us all out for fancy apartments nobody around here can afford." "I heard about that," Elena said carefully. "The case is going to the Supreme Court, isn't it?" The man snorted. "For all the good that'll do. Those judges don't care about people like us." Elena felt the familiar sting of those words but kept her expression neutral. "You don't think the court will rule in favor of the residents?" "When do they ever?" He gestured toward the construction barriers. "Money talks. Always has. What would you want them to know?" Elena asked. "If you could tell the justices one thing about this situation, what would it be?" The man seemed surprised by the question. He was silent for a long moment before answering. "I'd tell them this ain't just about buildings. It's about people. My wife and I have lived in that apartment for 42 years. Raised our kids there. Now our grandkids come visit every Sunday. Where we gonna go that we can afford on our fixed income? And it ain't just us. Ms. Rivera upstairs needs her special doctor at the clinic around the corner. The Kim family's business is their whole livelihood. We're all connected here." Elena nodded, taking in his words. "I hope the justices understand that." "Hope don't pay the rent," the man replied, but his tone had softened. "But thanks for listening anyway. Not many people do these days." As Elena continued her walk around the neighborhood, the man's words echoed in her mind alongside Jin's passionate arguments. By the time she headed back to the station to catch her train to D.C., her understanding of the case had deepened in ways no legal brief could have accomplished. On the train ride home, she made notes on her phone, not about legal precedents or constitutional principles, but about the human stakes of the decision facing the court. These notes wouldn't appear in her official opinion, but they would inform her approach to the case in ways both subtle and profound. As the landscape outside the window changed from urban neighborhoods to suburban sprawl, and finally to the outskirts of Washington, Elena reflected on the day's unexpected encounters. What had begun as a simple visit to her old neighborhood had evolved into something more meaningful, a reminder of why her work mattered and for whom she ultimately served. 3 weeks after her visit to the Bronx, Elena found herself thinking about the law students during a particularly tedious oral argument. The case involved tax code interpretations that even the most dedicated legal minds might find dry, and her mind wandered to the passionate debate she'd witnessed at Rosa's diner. She wondered how Jin was progressing with his paper on the housing case. True to his word, he had emailed her a week after their coffee shop conversation, sharing an outline and some preliminary research. She had responded with encouragement and a few carefully worded suggestions, making sure to frame her comments as those of an experienced lawyer, not a sitting justice. When the Chief Justice called a 15-minute recess, Elena retreated to her chambers. Her law clerks had prepared a stack of memos on pending cases, but she found herself drawn to her personal email on her private phone. Sure enough, there was a new message from Jin with the subject line, "Draft for your review if you have time." His timing was impeccable, or terrible, depending on how you looked at it. The court would be hearing arguments in the Bronx housing case the following week. Elena knew she should maintain her distance until after the court issued its opinion. And yet she was genuinely curious about Jin's perspective. She decided to at least read his email, even if she delayed reviewing the actual paper. "Dear Elena," he had written, "I've attached a draft of my note on community preservation in urban redevelopment cases. Your suggestions on incorporating resident interviews transformed the paper. I spoke with 12 families in the affected Bronx neighborhood, and their stories brought the legal issues to life in ways I never expected. If you have time to look at the draft, I'd be grateful for your feedback, especially on sections 3 and 4 where I discuss potential judicial approaches. No rush at all, I know everyone is busy. By the way, our moot court team is competing at Georgetown next weekend if you happen to be in D.C. and want to see legal theory and theatrical action. Best regards, Jin." Elena smiled at his friendly tone. The invitation to the moot court competition was touching if ironic. Little did he know she hadn't just been in D.C. and she lived there and worked less than a mile from Georgetown Law. She was about to close the email when her judicial assistant knocked on the door. "Justice Martinez, they're ready to resume in 5 minutes." "Thank you, Diane," Elena replied, slipping her phone into her desk drawer. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of arguments and questions. By the time Elena returned to her chambers, it was past 6, and the court building had grown quiet. Most of the staff had gone home, and only a few lights remained on in the offices of her fellow justices. Elena kicked off her formal shoes and padded in stocking feet to the comfortable chair by the window. From here, she could see the Capitol dome lit up against the darkening sky. She took out her phone again and opened Jin's email, this time downloading the attached paper. She told herself she would just skim it quickly, not making any notes until after the Bronx case was decided. But Jin's writing pulled her in immediately. He had a gift for blending rigorous legal analysis with compelling human stories. The interviews he'd conducted provided exactly the kind of perspective she had found missing in the official briefs. One account particularly struck her, an elderly woman who had created a community garden in what had once been an abandoned lot. For 20 years, she had transformed a space of urban decay into a source of food and beauty for her neighbors. The economic analyses submitted to the court reduced this to underutilized land with low property tax. Generation, missing entirely. The social value it provided. Elena was so absorbed in the paper that she didn't notice her phone battery running low until the screen suddenly went dark. She plugged it in and decided to continue reading on her computer, forwarding the email to her personal account. As she waited for her computer to boot up, Elena reflected on the strange position she found herself in. Reading a law student's paper that directly addressed a case pending before her was unusual, to say the least. But she wasn't learning any facts, not in the record, just gaining a fresh perspective on how to think about those facts. Her computer chimed with a new email notification as soon as she logged in. It wasn't from Jin, but from her daughter. "Mom, don't forget we're picking you up at 7:30 tomorrow for breakfast. Grace is excited to show you her science fair project before we drop her at school. Love you. Elena had completely forgotten the breakfast plan with her daughter and granddaughter. She sent a quick reply confirming she'd be ready, then opened Jin's paper to continue reading. By the time she finished, it was nearly midnight. Jin's analysis wasn't perfect. He occasionally let passion override precision, but his core arguments were sound and thought-provoking. His proposed judicial approach emphasized a more holistic valuation of community interests, while still respecting property rights and development needs. Elena made a few notes for herself, careful to keep them separate from her official case materials. She wouldn't respond to Jin until after the court issued its opinion, but his paper had given her much to consider. The next morning arrived too quickly. Elena barely had time to shower and dress before her daughter's car pulled up outside her townhouse. 10-year-old Grace bounded up the steps and flung herself into her grandmother's arms. "Grandma, wait till you see my project. I built a whole ecosystem in a bottle." Elena hugged her tightly. "I can't wait to see it, sweetheart." Breakfast at their favorite diner was chaotic and joyful, with Grace dominating the conversation with details about her science project and upcoming school play. Elena's daughter Lucia, a pediatrician at Children's National Hospital, looked exhausted but happy. "How's the court?" Lucia asked during a rare moment when Grace was occupied with her pancakes. "The usual," Elena replied. "Fascinating cases, strong opinions, occasional moments of unexpected consensus," Lucia laughed. "So diplomatic, Mom, even with family." After they dropped Grace at school, Lucia drove Elena to the Supreme Court building. As they pulled up to the imposing structure, Lucia shook her head. "I still can't believe my mother works here. Dad would have been so proud." Elena squeezed her daughter's hand. "He was proud of both of us just for who we are. The rest is just details." "Pretty impressive details," Lucia countered with a smile. "Love you, Mom. Dinner on Sunday?" "Wouldn't miss it." The day passed quickly in a flurry of opinion drafting and meetings with clerks. By late afternoon, Elena was reviewing briefs for the following week's arguments, including the Bronx housing case. Jin's paper kept coming to mind as she read the formal submissions, his human-centered approach offering a refreshing counterpoint to the technical legal arguments. Her concentration was broken by a knock at her door. Her judicial assistant entered with an apologetic expression. "I'm sorry to interrupt, Justice Martinez, but there's a situation in the Great Hall. A group of law students is here for a tour, and apparently one of them is making a scene about meeting you specifically." Elena frowned. "A scene? That's unusual. Did they say why? Something about meeting you in New York? Security's handling it, but I thought you should know." A sudden suspicion formed in Elena's mind. "This student, did they give a name?" "Jin something. He keeps insisting he knows you personally." Elena closed her eyes briefly. Of all the possibilities, this was one she hadn't anticipated. "Where are they now?" "Security was escorting them to the public tour area." "Should I tell them you're unavailable?" Elena considered her options. She could avoid the encounter, send a message that she was in meetings all afternoon. That would be the simplest solution. But something about it felt wrong, dishonest in a way that went against her personal values. "No," she said finally. "Please tell security I'll meet with the group briefly in the East Conference Room. Give me 5 minutes." After her assistant left, Elena straightened her judge's robe and checked her appearance in the small mirror on her office wall. The formal black robe and her carefully styled hair were a far cry from the casual outfit and loose ponytail she'd worn at Rosa's diner. When she entered the East Conference Room, a small group of students stood awkwardly near the door, looking both excited and intimidated by their surroundings. Jin was at the center, gesturing animatedly to a security officer who appeared unmoved by whatever argument he was making. Elena cleared her throat, and all heads turned toward her. The security officer immediately straightened. "Justice Martinez," he said with a nod. "These students were insistent about meeting you. I explained that's not part of the public tour." "It's all right, Officer Reynolds," she said calmly. "I can spare a few minutes." The officer nodded and stepped back. Elena's gaze found Jin, whose expression had transformed from frustration to shock. Beside him stood Trey, Audrey, and Pavel, the same group from Rosa's diner, all looking equally stunned. "I understand you're law students touring the court," Elena said, addressing the group. "Welcome to the Supreme Court of the United States." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Jin stepped forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're Justice Martinez?" "Elena Martinez?" She nodded, allowing a small smile. "The same, but we were..." Jin stammered, unable to form a coherent sentence. Trey found his voice next, his face flushing deep red. "Oh my God. At the diner. We were criticizing your opinion. To your face." "Rather passionately, as I recall," Elena replied, her tone gentle rather than accusatory. Audrey looked like she might faint. "Justice Martinez, I am so sorry for what we said. We had no idea." Elena raised a hand to stop the cascade of apologies. "Please, there's absolutely nothing to apologize for. Your critiques were thoughtful and well-reasoned even when I disagreed with them. But I said you were disconnected from regular people's lives," Trey blurted, looking mortified. "And something about bread being buttered." A laugh escaped Elena before she could suppress it. "Yes, well, that's why I visit my old neighborhood regularly, to make sure I don't lose that connection." The students exchanged bewildered glances. Pavel, who had been silent until now, asked the question clearly on all their minds. "Why didn't you tell us who you were?" Elena considered the question carefully. "Would you have spoken freely if you knew? Would you have challenged my reasoning so directly, or shared your honest opinions?" Their silence was answer enough. "The law thrives on robust debate," Elena continued, "on questioning assumptions and testing arguments. As a justice, I value hearing unfiltered perspectives, especially from the next generation of legal minds." Jin finally seemed to recover from his shock. "The paper I sent you, about the Bronx housing case, is thoughtfully written and raises important considerations," Elena finished for him. "Though I can't discuss the specifics of a pending case, I appreciate the work you put into it." "I can't believe Justice Elena Martinez has been reading my drafts," Jin said, looking dazed. "And critiquing them quite thoroughly," Elena added with a smile, "though now you understand why I can't continue to do so until after the court issues its opinion." Officer Reynolds cleared his throat discreetly, reminding Elena of the time. "I'm afraid I need to return to my chambers," she said. "But I'm glad we had this chance encounter. And I'm glad I got to meet all of you properly, names and all." As she turned to leave, Jin called after her. "Justice Martinez, will you still come to our moot court competition at Georgetown?" Elena paused at the door. "I'm afraid that would be rather conspicuous now that you know who I am. But I wish you all the best of luck. From what I witnessed at Rosa's, you have promising legal careers ahead of you." With that, she nodded to Officer Reynolds and departed, leaving the students staring after her in disbelief. Back in her chambers, Elena sank into her chair, a mix of emotions washing over her. The encounter had gone better than she might have expected, but it had definitely ended her anonymous correspondence with Jin. She would miss their exchanges, which had provided a rare connection to the unfiltered thinking of young legal minds. Her judicial assistant appeared at the door. "Is everything all right, Justice Martinez?" Elena smiled. "Yes, Diane. Just an unexpected reunion with some acquaintances." As her assistant withdrew, Elena turned back to the Bronx housing case briefs on her desk. She read them now with fresh eyes, seeing beyond the legal arguments to the community garden, the elderly man on his folding chair, and all the invisible threads that bound people to places and to each other. When the court heard arguments the following week, her questions would be shaped in small ways by a chance encounter at a diner and the honest critiques of students who hadn't known they were addressing a Supreme Court justice. And that, Elena thought, was exactly as it should be. 2 months had passed since the chance encounter at the Supreme Court. Summer had settled over Washington, D.C., bringing with it the familiar rhythm of the court's final weeks before recess. Elena sat in her chambers, reviewing the draft of her majority opinion in the Bronx housing case one last time, before it would be published the following morning. The 6-3 decision had surprised many court watchers. Elena had built a coalition that crossed the usual ideological lines, finding common ground in a nuanced approach to community preservation and economic development. The opinion acknowledged the government's interest in urban renewal while establishing stronger protections for existing communities and more comprehensive compensation requirements when displacement was unavoidable. As she read through the carefully crafted paragraphs, Elena could see traces of influences that would not be evident to others. the elderly man on his folding chair. The community garden tended for 20 years. Jin's passionate arguments about home versus property. None of these were cited in the footnotes, but all had shaped her thinking in subtle but meaningful ways. Her judicial assistant's voice came through the intercom. "Justice Martinez, your 3 o'clock appointment is here." Elena closed the draft folder on her computer. "Send them in, please." The door opened to reveal Rosa, looking somewhat out of place in the formal setting of the Supreme Court in her floral dress and sensible shoes. Behind her walked Jin, carrying a small gift bag and looking nervous but excited. "Rosa." Elena rose from behind her desk, embracing her old friend warmly. "And Jin, thank you both for coming." Rosa looked around the grand office with its high ceiling and walls lined with law books. "So this is where you hide when you're not eating eggs at my diner. Fancy." Elena laughed. "Not fancy enough to have your coffee, though." She led them to a small seating area by the window, where tea and cookies had been arranged on a silver tray. As they settled into the comfortable chairs, Elena noted how strange it felt to have these two worlds colliding. Her Bronx connection sitting in her chambers, surrounded by the trappings of judicial power. "I'm glad you could both make it," Elena said. "It means a lot to have you here." Rosa patted her hand. "Wouldn't have missed it. Though I still can't believe you never told me about this job of yours all these years." "Would you have treated me the same if you'd known?" Elena asked. Rosa snorted. "Probably not. I'd have made sure you got the freshest eggs, for one thing." They laughed, and the initial awkwardness began to fade. Jin had been quiet, taking in the surroundings with wide eyes. "This is incredible, Justice Martinez. Thank you for inviting us." "Elena, please," she said. "At least when we're not in public session." Jin nodded, still looking somewhat overwhelmed. "I brought you something." He handed her the small gift bag. "It's not much, but..." Elena opened it to find a framed photograph of Rosa's diner taken from across the street. It captured the early morning light hitting the old building, giving it a warm golden glow. "Jin took it," Rosa explained. "He's got a good eye, that one." "It's beautiful," Elena said sincerely. "Thank you. I'll keep it right here on my desk." As they sipped their tea, the conversation flowed more naturally. Rosa shared news from the neighborhood, who had gotten married, who had grandchildren now, the ongoing battle with the city about parking regulations. Jin talked about finishing his 2nd year of law school and his summer internship at a public interest law firm. "I've been following your grandmother's advice," he told Elena, "trying to stay connected to the communities I want to serve." Elena smiled. "Not my advice originally. My grandmother told me the same thing when I started law school. Never forget who you're working for," she used to say. "Speaking of work," Rosa said, setting down her teacup with a decisive clink, "the rumor mill says the housing case decision comes out tomorrow. Any hints for an old friend?" Elena raised an eyebrow. "Rosa, you know I can't discuss a case before the opinion is released." "Worth a try," Rosa said with a wink. "My sister's still worried sick about having to move." Jin leaned forward slightly. "I heard from my professor that you're writing the majority opinion. Whatever the outcome, I know it will be thoughtful." "Thank you for that vote of confidence," Elena replied. "I hope the opinion will speak for itself." She paused, then added, "Your paper was quite impressive, by the way. Your professor shared it with me officially last month after our unexpected meeting." Jin's face lit up. "Really? She didn't tell me that. She thought it might make you nervous, but it was excellent work. Well researched and persuasively argued, even if I didn't agree with every point." "I still can't believe I sent drafts to a Supreme Court justice for feedback," Jin said, shaking his head. "Or that I argued with you about your own opinion at Rosa's." "That was the best part," Elena said with a smile. "Hearing unfiltered perspectives is rare in my position. People tend to tell justices what they think we want to hear." "Not me," Rosa interjected. "I've been telling Elena her coffee order is boring for 30 years. Supreme Court didn't change that," they all laughed. And Elena felt a wave of gratitude for these connections to a world outside the sometimes isolating formality of the court. After they finished their tea, Elena gave them a private tour of the court building. She showed them the magnificent courtroom, explaining the traditions and procedures that govern the nation's highest court. In the library, she pointed out some of her favorite rare legal texts. Throughout the tour, she shared small personal stories. Her first oral argument as a young lawyer, the intimidating first day as a new justice, the surprising friendships that had formed across ideological lines. As they walked through the great hall with its imposing marble columns, Jin asked the question that had clearly been on his mind throughout the visit. Do you ever miss it? Being a regular lawyer, I mean. Working directly with clients instead of writing opinions. Elena considered the question carefully. Sometimes. There's an immediacy to that work. You see the impact of your efforts directly in people's lives. Here the effects are broader but often more abstract. She paused near a window overlooking the capital. That's why my visits to the Bronx are so important. They keep me grounded in the real-world implications of what we do here. When they reached the front steps of the court, Elena knew their time was coming to an end. She had another meeting scheduled, and Rosa needed to get back to the diner for the dinner shift. Before you go, Elena said, I have something for each of you. From her pocket, she produced 2 small velvet boxes. Inside each was a pin bearing the scales of justice, normally given only to court employees after years of service. These aren't official, she explained. They're from me personally, as a thank you for the perspective you both bring to my life. Rosa examined hers with a smile. Very fancy. I'll wear it on my apron. Jin looked at his pin with reverence. Thank you, Justice Elena. This means more than I can say. As they said their goodbyes, Elena felt a familiar tug between her 2 worlds. I'll try to visit the diner next month, she told Rosa. Same table? Always there for you, Rosa assured her. Though now I'm going to make sure you get the best eggs in the house. To Jin, Elena extended a different invitation. The court accepts new law clerks every year. When you finish school, I hope you'll consider applying. We need voices like yours. His eyes widened. Yes. I'll definitely consider it. They parted ways at the bottom of the court steps. Rosa and Jin heading toward the taxi stand, Elena returning to the hushed corridors of the court building. As she watched them go, she felt the value of these connections that crossed the boundaries of her official role, keeping her tied to the communities she had sworn to serve. The next morning, Elena arrived at the court early. Today was the last opinion day of the term, and the Bronx housing case would be announced. As was tradition, she would read a summary of her majority opinion from the bench, officially establishing the new precedent that would guide similar cases across the country. In her chambers, she found a small package on her desk with a note from her judicial assistant. Delivered this morning from Rosa's diner. Inside was a to-go container with 2 perfectly cooked eggs over easy, still somehow warm, and a handwritten note. For strength on the big day. We're all listening. Rosa Elena smiled, touched by the gesture. She ate the eggs at her desk while reviewing her bench statement one last time. An hour later, she sat in her place on the raised bench of the Supreme Court, the black robe settling heavily on her shoulders. The courtroom was packed with reporters, attorneys, and members of the public who had lined up before dawn to secure seats for the term's final session. As the Chief Justice called her name, Elena looked up to the public gallery and saw a familiar face. Jin had come to hear the opinion announced. Beside him sat Trey, Audrey, and Pavel, the same group from Rosa's diner. They looked different in formal clothes, nervously attentive to the court's proceedings, a far cry from their relaxed debate over breakfast months ago. Elena began to read her summary, her clear voice carrying through the hushed courtroom. In the case of Bronx Community Coalition versus New York Urban Development Authority, we consider the balance between economic revitalization and community preservation. As she outlined the court's reasoning and conclusion, she noticed Jin taking notes while his friends listened intently. When she reached the heart of the ruling, the new requirements for community, impact assessments, and expanded relocation assistance, she saw smiles breaking out among them. The opinion was not a complete victory for either side. Developers would still be able to pursue urban renewal projects, but communities would have stronger protections and greater voice in the process. It was a nuanced approach that reflected the complexity of the competing interests at stake. After the session ended, Elena returned to her chambers to find a text message from her daughter. Mom, your housing opinion is all over the news. Grace says her teacher is talking about it in social studies class today. So proud of you. Later that afternoon, as the court building quieted for the summer recess, Elena packed up a few files to take home. The photograph of Rosa's diner now sat on her desk, a reminder of where she came from and why her work mattered. Her phone buzzed with another message, this time from Jin. Thank you for a ruling that sees both the law and the people it affects. Your visit to the neighborhood made all the difference. Elena smiled as she placed the phone back in her pocket. He was right, though not in the way he probably imagined. It wasn't just that single visit, but all the visits over all the years. The ongoing commitment to remember that behind every case were real people with real lives. As she left the court for the day, Elena thought about her grandmother's words, never forget who you're working for. On the majestic steps of the Supreme Court, she paused and looked out at the city spreading before her, not just the monuments and government buildings, but the neighborhoods beyond, filled with people whose lives were shaped by the decisions made in these marble halls. She would be back at Rosa's diner next month, sitting at her corner table, listening to the conversations around her, staying connected to the world her opinions helped to shape, not because it was required, but because it was who she was, a justice who never forgot where she came from.